We move on now to the question of registry services, stability and security. And for that, we have two speakers who will now be addressing us. And, by the way, Channel B is also starting up again. So, again, time to make a decision. If you are interested in hearing about the future of Internet policy from Brian Cute from .org, then please go over to Channel B. He will be speaking next door. And I'll just let everybody have a moment or two to walk with their, decide with their feet. Okay, and moving right ahead then, I would like to introduce Ram Mohan. He is active in the ICANN community, known to many of you. He's a co-author of the Redemption Grace Period and of the IDN Implementation Guidelines, and he was a founding member of the Security and Stability Committee. He's also Executive Vice President and Chief Technology Officer of Afilias Limited, overseeing key strategic, management, and technology choices for the company. And he has led Afilias' strategic growth in registry services and security, as well as new product sectors. And he will be joined by Paul Twomey. Paul, are you here? Yes, there you are. Hello. Is one of the founding figures of ICANN as well. He was the founding chair of the Governmental Advisory Committee for 2 years. He was then president and CEO and senior president of ICANN from 2003 until January of 2010. He continued to work in the DNS arena, and he's extensively engaged in cybersecurity governance and operations. He's managing director and CEO of Argo Pacific as well, which is a technology investment and consulting firm. Gentlemen, welcome. Please take the stage.
Good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me fine? Okay, great. Paul, your mic check?
I think I work. Am I working?
That's good.
Yes, good.
Well, thank you for coming to this session. We figured we're going to talk about registry services with a focus on security and stability. But instead of having more PowerPoints for you to go through, we figured we'd actually speak to some of the topics and engage in a bit of a dialogue and then open it up for you folks to ask your questions and to get back and forth on this. Just as a context, as you know, starting in January 2012, ICANN will allow applications from any company, city, or organization in the world to manage their own generic top-level domain. Now, if you read what everybody is saying, or many people are saying, the new GTLD program will enable an unprecedented level of competition, innovation in the domain name marketplace. But at the same time, you also have folks asking, will this expansion cause security mayhem on the internet? And does ICANN's decision open the door to new attacks against corporate networks? So that's some of the thoughts on my mind and that I'm hoping we can talk about, Paul.
Yeah, and I think the other context to this is that the issues of security on the internet or resilience on the internet generally, I think, are becoming more of a challenge. And to a degree, an environment where we have had societies and corporations and others taking the productivity benefits of networking for the last 10, 15 years, but not having any consideration really about the downside risk that's come with it. I think the downside risk is now sort of catching up with us. Most of life is about benefits and risks. It's sort of a common sense statement, but to some degree the e-economy has been sort of ignoring that. And I think we've got a catch-up process. And so it's an interesting time to be thinking about how you're expanding the sort of real estate of the economy while you've got a sort of a sense in the wider community of suddenly security is a big issue. Coming to that point, there's a lot of these reports about, or sort of claims by some people in the media that, new GTLDs will be sort of vulnerable to criminal activity, criminal takeover, etc. sponsorship even. I mean, have you got thoughts, or how do you see that working, or valid, not valid?
Well, I think there's a lot of FUD out there, fear, uncertainty, and doubt about security problems when new TLDs come out. I read an article recently that posed the following question: what if I could own .1? Then I could, they postulated from there. Then I could go and create a domain name 127.0.0.1, which is a well-known address. I can hack things. What if I could get .local or .localhost, which is another technical domain name or top-level domain, and that could allow me to absolutely wreak havoc. And Paul, those are nice theoretical discussions, but for anybody who's read the ICANN guidebook will actually see that, first of all, numeric-only top-level domains are just banned. You can't apply for them, you won't get them. And you cannot apply for a top-level domain that is less than 3 characters in length. So some of these theoretical security problems that are posed sound nice in the abstract, but I think in reality there are a few more safeguards than perhaps you would think of. I guess the one question that also comes to mind is, so you got lots of new TLDs, is the ecosystem more vulnerable? My response to that is, I don't think it's significantly more vulnerable. I mean, today you have, if you really wanted to go and attack somebody, you could go get a second-level domain name and do the same thing that you would do on a top-level domain name. Why would you actually waste $185,000 on, something criminal when you could get it for $6? Makes no sense economically.
Yeah. So in my memory, from one of the reasons why the numbers are banned is actually because when you go back and look at some of the coding, some people inside into the DNS have actually just relied on numbers as an indication of IP addressing, yes. and they didn't want to have in pretty sloppily written code any confusion between what they were relying. If it came up as a number, therefore it was an IP address.
Right.
If it came up as a number and it was a domain name, that would cause all sorts of confusion. And so
you're right.
And so things like that. I mean, there was a lot of thought gone into how to think that through.
Yeah, and you look at one, for example. Hey, if you got L, if you applied for .L and you got .L, well, you could, in some fonts, L looks like a 1. But you can't get that really. You could write an article about, or you could pose a question about how it's a big security problem, but you can't actually get it. Yeah. You can apply for it, and that's $185,000 down the drain.
Maybe it's worth talking through a little bit the way in which people who are either launching botnets or phishing or farming attacks and registering large numbers of domain names for command and control, or for fast flux command and control. Maybe it's worth talking through about how they do that, because that has lessons, I think, for how you run registry, certainly how you run the process of registering and takedown. Certainly.
If you look at phishing, if you look at the average attack that comes through, it's pretty well done. I mean, the guys who are doing it have a clear financial intent behind it. It's not just folks trying to, poke fun at somebody else or gain a little feather in their cap. But if you were to phish Deutsche Bank, I don't need to get Deutsche Bank or something like that, because it's coming to you, to the person who is attacked, it's coming to you via an email most likely. It's an email that looks just like a Deutsche Bank regular email. And there are 8 links, one that says privacy policy, another that says click here to verify that we're really Deutsche Bank, and they're all leading to the same phishing site. And the URL, if you actually look at the resource, somewhere in there, it'll say Deutsche Bank. But it rarely is deutschebank.de or .com or whatever. And they're relying on users not paying attention. I don't see how that problem is going to go away. New TLDs, old TLDs, the fundamental problem with phishing is that it's a user beware issue.
It is, although I can imagine that just take that example. I can imagine banks or a banking community or anybody else around a TLD. I think the opportunity for brands to reinforce in their out of context messaging to their customers, if it's .this, you can trust it. I mean, I can certainly see. I can see over the next 5 years, people who've got brands, especially where there is phishing vulnerabilities, actually reinforcing the whatever brand as a way of saying, look for that in the email, look for that and stuff. That's going to be important. Or is there going to be difficulty there?
That's a really cool point, because you cannot fake that. You can fake something.com or something whatever. But if you're .bank, only .bank owns it, and you can verify that. So yeah, you're probably right there. I think there is an enhancement, if you will, to the trust. But if a bank or a financial institution says mail from .financial institution is us,
right?
It's really us.
The GTLDs are required to use DNSSEC, the new ones.
True.
Which does increase, in some degree, it increases the confidence that the second level actually is linked to the TLD. You actually are going to the website. Yeah,
you're right. And the DNSSEC, it guarantees that once you as a user click on a particular domain name or a particular link, you cannot be hijacked. It just is not possible to be hijacked in any easy way, right?
Yeah.
So you're right. That combination is a good double header.
Yeah, it's interesting because I've been somewhat amused by some of these articles writing about the risks of new GTLDs along the ways you said, because these particular points about GTLDs means more of the top-level domain space actually is faster registered, has DNSSEC, and has the opportunity for branding association. While if you actually look at people using FastFlux and then using domain names as the command and control system, they tend to go to country codes that have got very slow processes for changing and takedown. Paper-based systems that take 6 weeks or something. So they're not going to go away from there.
No, you're totally right. CCTLDs are a far easier target. GTLDs are under a little bit more scrutiny, if you will, compared to CCTLDs. And if I was a spammer, I think that's one place that there might be a bit of a risk. If ICANN approves a new GTLD, and that GTLD operator decides, I'm just going to give it away, or I'm going to give it for 5 cents, or 2 cents, or something like that, it's probably going to get used by the spam controllers. They'll probably buy 100,000 domain names a day and just send out millions of spam. But to some extent, that's self-correcting, because you do that, and about 3 weeks later, as a TLD, you're dead, because you're blocked everywhere. But it's not a good return on investment for the TLD operator. What about so? Is there such a thing as a secure TLD? You think?
Oh, I don't. I think frankly, the concept of security on the internet's a misnomer anyway. I mean, I think where networks interact with networks, we should talk much more about resilience than we should talk about security per se. We're much more, it's got much more similarities with sort of biological ecosystems than it does with fortresses and walls and castles on the Rhine and all that, that sort of thing. Is there a secure TLD? There is a proposal that was out. They never got full consensus across the community for implementation for what criteria you could look for in setting up a GTLD, and you can see that on the ICANN website. And I think it's not a bad checklist for people who are thinking about setting up a TLD. Existing registry operators have to have that. I think many of them have it in place. People who are thinking of setting up a registry, I think it's a useful tool to take. If you're having a conversation with a registry operator as somebody who's going to support you, I think it's a useful tool to have them bring along and say, well, where do you fit on this proposal? I think that's a good test, but there's no such thing, I think, as a secure GTLD. I think one of the things, if I think about that further, especially in the sort of community or the brand or those sort of operators that people are thinking of applying, some of the things that are really key here are actually not technical. A lot of the security issues are actually personnel and people. They're personnel and people in terms of checking the backgrounds of who's operating on the system. Nearly every IT department, you'll have all sorts of people who are contractors, and you know, the standard thing in privacy normally is it's the database administrator who's a contractor who's the risk. And I think that's a set of issues about personnel. And I think the other set of things there is about who's involved in your general administration and management board. I mean, again, I think the issue is about ensuring that the people involved are good and strong and tested, and you'd be surprised how many times that things will emerge where people have not thought that through. And I think if it's not your core business, if you don't do that every day of the week, I think that's a vulnerability you've got to be very careful of. You know, if you're contracting with somebody who does that every day of the week, I think that risk is less because they've been put through the tests. But if you're not, then you've really got to, that's one of the things you want to pay attention to, I think.
I hear what you're saying. I mean, at Afilias, which I help run, it's one of the things that we do is ensure that the people who are there actually get vetted, go through criminal background checks, etc. These are the engineers and the guys who are actually touching the systems. I see what you're saying about if you're running a .bank or a dot whatever, finance, TLD, your weakest link could be right within your own shop or within your contractor's shop.
Yeah, I mean, I think reputational risk is going to be one of the biggest issues in the new GTLD round. I think for a number of reasons. First of all, coming back to my opening comments about the changed security environment, we are in an increasing environment of hacktivism, and with an interesting set of neo-anarchic sort of values driving that. This is going to be, to a degree, this is going to be an expression of a new orthodoxy on the internet, and there's going to be a whole bunch of people who are going to want to cause embarrassment to that, I think. And so I think there's, we have to watch out for people who are, for that sort of hacktivist activity. And then when you look at that and you say, well, we're hacktivists, what would they want to do? The things that are going to be interesting, or criminals for that matter, particularly hacktivists, I think the maintenance of customer data. So you've got the registry operation, you've got the registrar. Some of the new GTLDs which are brand are going to have, or community ones are going to be basically trying to get their own registrar. They'll set the rules up, which is you can within the system. Sure. So they end up with only one or two registrars. Maybe it's an association who does it for them. And then these people are not usually, for instance, carrying credit card details. So who's holding all the credit card details? Who's holding all the information about the customer? They're natural targets for either a hacktivist or for a criminal group. Coming back to the question of reputation, if you've got a problem with personnel and that becomes public, the sort of WikiLeaks type thing, I think, is going to be a potential vulnerability in this space as well. If I put my brand up and I don't look up, I don't think through these issues, is my brand going to be more vulnerable to somebody trying to embarrass me using this mechanism? And it's the applications layer above running the registry, I think. It's especially the things about, I would think, customer data. I mean, in the United States last year, the average cost for a breach of personal data for people who were holding personal records was $220 per record, of which about $75 was actual cost and the rest was churn, was customer churn, people leaving that place because of the cost. So, there are ways in which you can measure that risk. As I said, I think reputational risk is going to be as big an issue to think through in the security environment as the technical parts around fishing and farming, etc.
I hear you. One of the things where I think there's actually a significant risk, and this is if you're today you find registrars who get registration systems hacked. And the way the hack happens is with a lost password, attempt. And you'll find systems where in today's ICANN registrar environment, you'll find some registrars. You can go in and you can send any number of requests to create a new password, and you can send any number of them. They don't automatically say after 3 or 4 tries we're going to stop you, or after 3 or 4 invalid attempts to log in we're going to stop you, right? And there are well-known ways to use that to hack through. I expect that some of that is now going to move to registries. The risk is going to increase into registries because you have admin pages. Registries run control panels and admin pages, just as registrars run control panels and admin pages. So the same techniques are likely to just migrate upstream. The other technical area where I expect some level of risk is you don't actually have to hack the registry at all. All you've got to do is hack the DNS provider, and you're done, right? You have a TLD delegated, and let's say the registry has decided it's going to run the actual registry operations in-house, but they outsource the DNS provision to somebody else. And if they haven't done the checks, and they don't see whether that, whoever they've outsourced to has the right security posture, all a hacker has to do, or a hacktivist has to do, is compromise the DNS. Now, don't worry about the registration data. You just redirected the entire TLD completely. Every domain name, every email, everything just gets redirected. And if you're really smart, you wouldn't redirect. If you're really smart, you would just be man in the middle. You would redirect, listen, and pass it to the real source, right? And most people would not know at all. I think that's real. That's likely to happen.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the interesting challenge about this whole move towards new TLDs, and we're seeing it in risk issues facing at the application layer. So forget about the domain names, but for companies running databases and what have you, there's a certain flight to experience, a flight to size, flight to scale going on, I think, in the provision there, which is probably inevitable for some of the reasons I think you said before, which I think is things come down to, is this your core business or not, in some respects. Mm-hmm. And even in large corporates, and people want to host these things in the large corporate, I think it's worth talking through these issues. I mean, as I said before, I think our focus should be about resilience. It's very easy to scare everybody about security, while the real issue is saying, look, there are security risks, understand what those risks are, and then either prepare to combat them or have a resiliency framework in place to actually know what to do when something goes wrong, what to do in response. And I think a key part of that experience becomes quite important. So I think we'll find, with the emphasis upon security on the new, when I watched the new GTLD program from 2000 or 2003, the expectation, I think, was that we would have an increase in registries and all sorts of technical operators, etc. I think the emphasis upon security, as well as other issues around scale, means that there's more likely that what we'll have is the TLD itself separates more as an intellectual property string, if you like to put it that way, and that the people who actually do a lot of the sort of provision of technical tends to come back to those with the experience and the scale. I mean, there are some new players coming into it, but I think that's somewhat inevitable. But I think the challenge remains for the person who's got an accountability for that string to nevertheless still be conscious of what the security issues are, mm-hmm. and be holding their provider to that test. I think that's going to be an important part of ongoing management, is to say, what advice do we have and what standards do we have to keep maintaining our supplier to a sort of degree of confidence that these issues are being addressed, or that we're getting reports upon the nature of the risk that we're facing.
Right, and if you're running a TLD, it's not a security problem you're managing, as you said, a reputational problem, you're managing a risks problem. Security is only one component of the whole thing. Yeah. And certainly with the brands that I'm working with, that seems to be significant. At the board level, at the C level, that's the kind of things that folks are worrying about. I rarely have interactions with actual technologists. Most of the interactions tend to be, at the level of, so how can we make sure that the risks posed by entering into this new area of business are appropriately mitigated, and that there is some resilience and some strategy to actually come back if it goes down. It seems that that's the general direction. I guess one of the questions, perhaps it's even my last question to you, is there a stability problem? We've talked about security, and we've talked about security and risks, etc. What about stability?
Well, I don't think there's a stability problem to the domain name system, to say the root server system. I think one or two of the root server operators have more of a challenge than others because they're configured differently and they have different resources, etc. But for the root server system as a whole, I don't think there's a stability issue. They can handle, the root zone can handle tens of thousands of new TLDs. I think there's a potential, I wouldn't call it a stability question, but people talked about confusion, and there's obviously going to be, as happens in any liberalised market, for a period of time you get a certain degree of confusion in the consumer base. I think the biggest stability problem comes back to the point I said before about reputation. I think if the new GTLD round is introduced and the top-level domains that are introduced move smoothly, that'll be very good. If, however, there is seen to be reputational risk issues with a number of the TLDs that come up, either because the people who are associated with them, we suddenly find out are noted criminals, noted terrorists, noted whatever, or because some things fail very quickly, then I think you have a stability issue that emerges, but it's more of a stability issue that comes out of a lack of faith in the new system. But overall, technically, I don't see a stability question at all. I mean, the system can handle this very easily. There will need to be some ongoing updating of software, application-level software, and ongoing updating of registrar software to handle the new strings. But I think that's we saw that several years ago, and we'll see it again with IDNs, really.
Right.
So perhaps we should see if there are any questions from the floor. I don't know. We're self-moderating up here. There's an unknown gentleman.
Peter Dingate Thrush from Minds and Machines. Paul, I agree very much with your opening statement, which is that the user community has been taking the benefits of connectivity from the internet for the last 10 or 15 years without sharing its responsibility. No user goes on thinking that they've got a personal responsibility, I think, for security or resilience. The question then is, what's the role of the hardware manufacturers and the browser manufacturers and some of those more institutional players? You've said, I think, you've talked about the registries and the registrars. What about some of these other players who I don't think are in the room, but what's their responsibility for some of this?
Well, this is a sort of quite a major debate going on at governmental levels at the moment, it gets quite fascinating. What seems obvious stops being obvious. So let me give you an illustration in the Australian environment that I know quite well, and you probably know well. The internet service providers, who are not the hardware but they're the transit players, have put in place an industry code to inform their customers if they think their customers are infected by a botnet, and have talked about potentially, not moving there yet, talked potentially about putting customers who are infected into quarantine. Now, this is a commercial reaction to some government pressure, and in the Australian context, there's not a question being raised about censorship. The same discussion which has taken place in the White House for the last 12 months or longer around this discussion gets caught up with, first of all, the First Amendment. Does the government have any role not to do that? And even some of the ISPs are coming back saying, we don't think our customer set is going to accept that we can be having that much knowledge of their transit data. And there are some law issues in the United States. There's quite specific laws that the Congress has to change to let that happen. Again, you put this into a context like China and it all looks very different. So I think it is a debate, And I think it's going to be an increasing debate, and I think it's a debate the internet community needs to have broadly, because part of this debate at the moment is taking place amongst governments at a national security level. There's a whole series of proposals around norms for the use of cyberspace, where there's an assumption from that group that you can interdict, because they were brought up on the interception regime. And they're sort of bringing their interception mindset to this problem, right? And I think there's a subtle discussion needs to take place about where do you do this, and we could have a long discussion with this, because I think there's a risk of breaking the commons at the protocol level by some of these discussions about governments about, can I interdict? So that's a long answer, Peter, but I think the challenge is going to be about the definition of what is wrongdoing, and do you get a common sense of what wrongdoing is, and therefore to take it to a manufacturer. I mean, Cisco's got in trouble in the past with accusations that it's done just that for certain markets.
Other questions?
Observations? Comments that we talk nonsense?
All right.
No, Peter's got another one. Well done.
Ah, there you go.
And having asked Paul a question, only fair I ask Ram one. I'm really intrigued by the statement that you can't fake a TLD. Can you elaborate on that? Is there no known spoofing or faking technique that would allow someone to fake a TLD? You were talking, and this was in the context of hiding Deutsche Bank somewhere in a fake URL.
Sure. I was talking about kind of what the industry practices. You can technically, especially in email, I can claim to be anybody from anywhere, and no one would know any better. And having a new TLD or an existing TLD doesn't give you any special advantage. The real point I was making was that you can do that, all of those techniques for $6 or $3. You wouldn't want to spend $185,000 buying your own TLD when you can just do it for pennies on the dollar right now.
One of the things we were talking about earlier today, which is interesting, is one of the things that's been accused around this is that, you'll know this, the risk of IDNs, and that an internationalized domain name will be confusing and therefore potentially a basis for sort of criminal activity. And the case point often used in the technical community discussions, if I take Greek, that I could write alpha tau tau, and it looks a little bit like a certain well-known American telecommunications company. So I could get dot alpha tau tau, and this is a source of potential risk. Well, I could spend $250,000 or $500,000 getting that, and it'll get turned off so quickly. What's the point of doing that? But the other thing that's really interesting is that you can do that at the second levels since 2003. We've actually had protocols in place, for the rules in place for how to have IDN dot Roman character since 2004.
2004. And if you really wanted to do it, you wouldn't do it in an ICANN GTLD anyway. You would go find a CCTLD operator who's going to take a long time to respond. Yeah. You would get alpha tau tau there, and you would run a global phishing campaign, and you would be very successful, because it'll be, by the time they catch up to you, you've gone on to the next, maybe it's alpha, omega, lambda.
Now, we don't want to be telling people what to do, but the interesting observation in our conversation is we can't think of an instance that either of us have heard of where somebody's done that. Now, that probably means after tomorrow it'll start, but it's just interesting also. This brings me back to my point about the difference between security and resilience and risk management, is that in some of these discussions around the security issues around new GTLDs, you can get technical discussions about what is feasible. There's a whole set of economic and social realities of what people actually will do, I think, that also needs to be considered.
Other thoughts, other questions? If not, we'll give the stage back to you.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much to Ram Mohan and to Paul Twomey for that very interesting dialogue. I think you've provided lots of sparks that are probably going to inflame some questions in the course of the afternoon. So some of them may come back to you.